Cardinal Robert Sarah's book, The Power of Silence, is divided into three main parts, each with several chapters. Part 1, Silence Against the Dictatorship of Noise. Chapter 1, The Loss of Silence. Chapter 1 discusses the loss of silence in our modern society. The author argues that we are constantly surrounded by noise and that silence has become a rarity. He suggests that the loss of silence can have detrimental effects on our mental and physical health. Chapter 2, The Importance of Silence in the Bible. Chapter 2 explores the importance of silence in the Bible. The author argues that God often communicates through silence and that, in the absence of words, he can find meaning and purpose. He also highlights the importance of silence in meditation and prayer. Chapter 3, The Silence in the Life of Jesus. Chapter 3 looks at the life of Jesus and how he values silence. The author highlights several times in the life of Jesus when he withdrew to quiet places to pray and reflect. He argues that silence was an important part of Jesus' spirituality and that we can learn from his example. Chapter 4, Silence in the Liturgy. Chapter 4 discusses the role of silence in the liturgy. The author argues that silence can be a powerful way to connect with God and others. He highlights the importance of silence before and after communion and suggests that silence can help us enter a deeper state of prayer. Chapter 5, Silence in the Monastic Tradition. Chapter 5 explores the monastic tradition and how silence is valued in that community. The author highlights the importance of silence in monastic life and suggests that we can learn from this tradition to find more silence in our own lives. Chapter 6, Silence as Resistance to the Culture of Noise. Chapter 6 discusses the culture of noise and how we can resist it through silence. The author argues that silence can be a powerful form of resistance against the constant noise in our lives. He suggests that we can find more silence in our lives by limiting the use of technology and finding quiet times to pray and meditate. Part 2, The Silence in the Spiritual Life. Chapter 8, Silence in Prayer. In this chapter, Cardinal Sarah talks about silence in prayer. He emphasizes that prayer is not just a dialogue with God, but also a quiet time to hear God's voice. He argues that many times we talk too much during prayer and don't listen to what God has to say. Cardinal Sarah also highlights that silence is not just an absence of words, but also an interior attitude of listening. Chapter 9, Silence as a Means of Listening to God. In this chapter, Cardinal Sarah talks about silence as a means of listening to God. He highlights that God speaks to us in many ways, but that we often don't hear his voice because we are too busy with our own voices and concerns. Cardinal Sarah argues that we need silence to hear God's voice in our lives, and that silence helps us to discern God's will for us. Chapter 10, Silence as a Path to Contemplation. In this chapter, Cardinal Sarah talks about silence as a path to contemplation. He emphasizes that contemplation is not just an activity reserved for monks and nuns, but something we can all cultivate in our lives. Cardinal Sarah argues that silence helps us to get in touch with the mystery of God and to perceive the divine presence in all things. Chapter 11, Silence as a Source of Inner Peace. In this chapter, Cardinal Sarah talks about silence as a source of inner peace. He argues that inner peace is a gift from God and that we can cultivate it in our lives through silence. Cardinal Sarah points out that the modern world often exposes us to an excess of stimuli and information, which can lead to anxiety and stress. He argues that silence helps us find peace in God and live serenely. Chapter 12, Silence as Release from Anxiety. In this chapter, Cardinal Sarah talks about silence as release from anxiety. He argues that anxiety is a common reality in our lives, but that we can find release through silence. Cardinal Sarah points out that silence helps us to encounter God's presence in our lives and to trust in his providence. Part 3, Silence in the Contemporary World. Chapter 13, The Need for Silence in the Contemporary World. In this chapter, Cardinal Sarah talks about the need for silence in the contemporary world. He argues that the modern world is marked by a culture of noise and distraction, which can lead to alienation and dehumanization. Cardinal Sarah points out that Chapter 13, The Need for Silence in the Contemporary World. In this chapter, the author reflects on the importance of silence in contemporary society. which is increasingly noisy and distracted. He points out that excess noise can lead to loss of concentration, stress, anxiety, and mental disorder. Silence, on the other hand, can help restore inner peace and mental clarity. The author also discusses how technology such as smartphones and social media have created a culture of noise and how the practice of silence can help balance these influences. Chapter 14, Silence in Culture. In this chapter, the author examines the role of silence in culture, from art to politics. He argues that silence can be used to convey a stronger message than words and can be used as a form of protest or resistance. He also discusses how music and literature can use silence to create tension and emotion. In addition, the author explores how silence can be used in film and television, highlighting how the lack of dialogue can be powerful in certain situations. Chapter 15, Silence as a Means of Reconciliation. In this chapter, the author discusses how silence can be a means of reconciliation in conflict situations. He argues that silence can help diffuse tension in a confrontational environment and can allow people to listen better. The author also explores how silence can be used as a way of apologizing or expressing forgiveness in personal or political situations. Chapter 16, Silence as a Response to Violence. In this chapter, the author discusses how silence can be used as a response to violence, both on a personal and political level. He discusses how silence can be a form of resistance and how a lack of response can be more effective than violence or direct confrontation. The author also examines how silence can be used as a way to remember and honor victims of violence. Chapter 17, Silence as a Form of Solidarity. In this chapter, the author explores how silence can be used as a form of solidarity with those who suffer. He discusses how silence can help create space for pain and sadness and can allow people to be more compassionate. The author also examines how silence can be used as a way to honor those who have no voice and how it can be used as a way to show solidarity with those who are marginalized. In the last chapter of the book, entitled Silence as a Means of Encountering the Other, Cardinal Robert Sarah reflects on the importance of silence in communication and human relationships. He starts by stating that, in order to really communicate with each other, we need to learn to listen. And to listen, we need to cultivate silence in our lives. Silence helps us better understand ourselves and others, discern our thoughts and feelings, and create space to hear the voice of the other. Sarah also emphasizes that silence does not mean indifference or withdrawal, but rather a willingness to listen and understand the other. He argues that silence is a gesture of love and respect for others, as it allows us to accept their words and feelings without judgment or prejudice. The Cardinal also highlights that silence is essential for building peace and harmony in our interpersonal and social relationships. When we meet in silence with one another, we are invited to set aside our differences and seek a mutual understanding based on empathy and respect. Finally, Sarah concludes that silence is a source of encounter with the other, as it allows us to transcend the barriers of language and culture and connect with the deepest and most spiritual dimension of the human being. He invites us to cultivate silence in our lives as a means of encountering the other in his humanity and of growing together in building a more just and fraternal world.